Hey, it's Sam, and I'm here today talking about Saturn transits to Bhava Padas using Angelina Jolie's chart. I'll be looking at her breast surgeries and also her relationship with Brad Pitt. This is part of the Gemini astrology system, so check this out. Hey, it's Sam, and I'm doing this video about Angelina Jolie and a continuing case study using her chart and the Bhava Padas used in the Gemini system. I did an earlier video where I explained how to use the Bhava Padas using her chart, and in it we looked at the fact that the Padas show a kind of manifestation of karma when you're looking at someone's natal chart. It's very easy to find them. All you do is you calculate from the Bhava itself to its ruler, and then the same number of houses to from the ruler to find the Bhava Pada. Like, for instance, in Angelina Jolie's chart, we can see this Pada chart here, and you see, for instance, she has the 5th house Pada in the 1st house. That's because the 5th house is Scorpio, and if you count from the 5th house to its ruler, we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 houses from Scorpio to Mars, and then 5 houses from Mars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that puts the Pada in the 1st house. So, for instance, if we want to look at the 11th house Pada in the 3rd house, we would find the fact that the 11th house is here, which is Taurus. And if you count from Taurus to its ruler, 1, 2, 3, you find that it's Venus here, 3 houses from the Pada, then 1, 2, 3 from Venus would then put the 11th house Pada here. So it's very easy to do once you figure out how to do it. You see that it's a pretty straightforward calculation. So what we're going to do today is actually just now look at a few deeper examples of how to use these Padas. In the first video, we were just talking in general about how to understand tangible things that play out. For example, you see that Angelina Jolie has the 1st and 7th house Padas and the 2nd house Padas all in Scorpio. And this means that her 1st house, which is her identity, and her 7th house, which is partners, and also her 2nd house, which has to do with values and family and money, will play out in a very intense kind of Scorpio way because they're in the sign of Scorpio, and also in a very 5th house field of life, which means the relationship, to her children and her creativity will all greatly influence her personal identity, because that's the 1st house, and 1st house Pada, 7th house, which is her partners, and even 2nd house, which is her money and her values. So we can see how children and creativity is a great field of expression for both her individual identity, her relationships, and also her money and her values, because that's really what money is about. So, for example, the way we see these things evolving in her life is that, 2nd house especially, is that this evolution of our values beyond just the values of our birth family to the family that we create later in life, and how our money is an expression and an extension of that, but also our impact and the wealth that we give to the world is also evolving through the 2nd house. So you can see how taking, for instance, just her desire for acceptance as a celebrity and sort of evolving that into something higher has changed through things like children and raising children. Also, her own identity and her relationships, again, have all evolved through the realm and the field of children and that sort of creative passion in her life. It's very easy to see that when you look at this 1st and 2nd house Pada and 7th house Pada in her 5th house of children. So again, Padas are very Bhava related. They're very much about the houses. And again, the houses are very much about the literal, tangible things that show up in our life. We often get very sort of enamored with planets and signs. We're very sign-oriented because signs are quite psychological and things like that. And it's very easy for us because we're quite psychological and emotional. But the houses and the bhavas are really how our life evolves and unfolds. And so this is why this part of Gemini astrology is very interesting and predictive, and you can learn a lot about what really unfolds in a person's life by evaluating these padas. I need a quick drink. One more. All right, so let's take a look at a couple events. And I have some notes here, as you see. One says breasts, and the other says marriage. And so we can see, it says that on February 16th, 2013, at age 37, Jolie underwent preventive double mastectomy after learning she had 87% risk of developing breast cancer due to carrying the defective BRCA1 gene. So, of course, this is a pretty well-known procedure and a pretty well-known thing that happened in her life. Now, this is the progeny chart for February 17th, 2013. And we're looking at the transit of Saturn here. Let me go back to her chart. So let's look at these padas, and we can see she has the 8th house pada here in Libra. And then, as we said, the 1st and 7th house pada here in the 5th house in Scorpio. 8th house pada in the 4th house of Libra, and the 1st and 7th house and 2nd house pada in Scorpio. So we're going to be looking at Saturn's transits through these through these two houses of Scorpio and Libra. So we're going to go back a couple years to look at the breast transit, and we can understand that she had the transits influencing her, the breast work and the fear around the double mastectomy and all of that. When Saturn was going through the 4th house, of course, 4th house of the breasts, and over the 8th house pada. 8th is about what? Death, fear of death, and actually loss and losing things, right? This sort of terror that you're going to die of cancer. Very 8th house. Where do you see the 8th house relationship there? While that was happening, well, you see that the pada was in the 8th house. And then we've also seen, after that, a big focus on marriage when Saturn went into Scorpio and went over the 1st and 7th house padas. So let's take a look at that again on this transit screen. So we see this is February 17th, 2013, right? February 17th, 2013, Saturn was going through that 4th house cusp, going through her 4th house and going over the 8th house pada, as I just said. Was also aspecting her 1st house. So this important transit is clearly shown, and it's one of the most effective ways to use bhavapadas with transits. So bhavapadas with transits are very important. Of course, they also have to line up with the dashas. And, we can look at the dashas here in a second as well. But especially this transit of Saturn and Rahu going through her 8th house shows very clearly, going over her 8th house pada is shown with this urgent surgery. And again, it was going through her 4th house of the breasts, 4th house of motherhood, her as a mother, her breasts, eighth house, fear of death. Literally, the disease of cancer is related to the eighth house, and Saturn goes through the fourth house, aspects her first house by transit because it's aspecting the sign of Cancer, and literally takes away her breasts. Saturn going through her fourth house, and she had a double mastectomy. Elective. She elected to do it basically because of the fear of getting cancer. And fear is eighth house. She didn't get cancer. She just had the fear of it because of this BRCA1 gene. BRCA1 gene. So again, eighth house is the fear of death. Saturn goes over that at that time in her fourth house, and she electively removes her breasts, basically destroys her breasts. Eighth house of destruction. Very powerful. Then next, Saturn goes into her fifth house and over the first and seventh house padas. Now, actually, Jolie and Brad Pitt married August 23rd, 2014. And then they separated 2 years later in September 2016. So this is, very interesting as well. You can see that Angelina Jolie had a change of her dashas as well. At this time, her dashas changed into the Sun dasha in 2015, but she was married at the end of Venus dasha. But again, if we run the transits, we'll see August 23rd, 2014. So let's run the transits forward. Oops, August 2014. Oops, let's run it forward a year. That's March 2014. Saturn goes right up to the edge and then goes back. And then we run it forward a few months. It goes back. Saturn, it was around September that Saturn, actually it was actually November 2014 that Saturn set up for its transit through Scorpio for the next couple of years. But again, while Saturn was going through her, or going over her first and seventh house padas, she engaged in the relationship with Brad Pitt during this whole time. So again, Saturn then went over her first and seventh house padas and second house, which has to do with family, all that stuff I said. Saturn goes over it, she gets married and divorced by the end of it. Or, married and then separated. So they make it formal. They had been together for like 10 years before that. But then Saturn, again, Saturn is about making things permanent, making things legal, making a commitment to something. It was right at the very end of Venus Dasha, Venus Ketu. I would have said, don't get married. One thing people do at the end of Venus Dasha, I always tell people, here's a clue, and here's a very important secret. Anyone in Venus Ketu, many times they either want to get married or do something like buy property, because it's to make something permanent. Venus, a 20-year cycle is ending, and the sun is coming, and the sun is ready to start kind of burning things up, and people reach for something permanent. Usually it's something like get married, which is a very typical Venus Ketu thing to do, because Venus wants to try to make that relationship permanent when we feel it changing. Or do something like buy a house, again, because that's also something permanent while everything's changing. So she was in Venus Ketu, and then Saturn is going over the first and seventh house and second house pada in Scorpio, and she gets married. Again, Saturn transiting over the Bhava pada. When Saturn transited over the Bhava pada earlier, going through her fourth house, over the eighth house pada, it literally took away her breasts because of the fear of cancer. She went and had elective surgery to have her breasts removed. Fourth house stuff. Basically killed her breasts in order to live because of the fear of death, eighth house. Then Saturn goes over the first, seventh, and second house pada, and she gets married to Brad Pitt and then separates during that transit. As we see, it was separated September 2016. So let's go to September 2016. Forward, September 2016. Again, so it's still going to be going over the Pada. Here's September 2016. Saturn is right in the middle of Scorpio. So again, you can see even when she started it, it was August 2014, and actually you see that in August 2014, Saturn had gone up right close to the edge, July. So August, Saturn was moving forward. It was right up near the cusp. You know, when it happened, Saturn was still in that fourth house. But then by the time it went in to Scorpio, she had just gotten married. And so she was working with the marriage at that time. And Saturn was then in the house and the sign that has her first and seventh house cusp. So again, that whole time when she was working, where she started the marriage with Brad Pitt and then ended it, Saturn was going through that same sign and house by transit as her first and seventh house and second house Bhava cusps. So very interesting that during that transit of Saturn going over the first, seventh, and second house Bhava cusps, she was trying to make the relationship with Brad Pitt work, trying to make a commitment to it, and then finally left it. What changed is she changed dashas during that time, because she started it in Venus Ketu, and then she was in Venus Ketu, and then we scroll down, we'll see it was Venus Ketu, and then so she was in Venus Ketu, and then by the end of it, she was in Venus, or I'm sorry, then by the end of that transit through Scorpio, or I'm sorry, through Libra, she had gone into the Sun Dasha. Think about this software, it doesn't have an auto scroll. So anyway, she went from Venus Ketu when Saturn was at the very end of Libra, and then she married Brad Pitt when it had first gone into Scorpio. Then by the end, she went into the Sun Dasha. As you can see, Venus Ketu, she went into August 2013, and I'm sorry, in July 2013. So August 2014. So she went into Venus Ketu at the end of July 2014. August 23rd, 2014, she marries Brad Pitt. Then she goes into the Sun in 2015. And then by that time, Saturn, again, was clearly over the first and seventh house Pada when she went into Sun Dasha, and then that switches everything. That changes everything. Saturn was also, as we say, by transit here, Saturn was then aspecting her Sun. Saturn was aspecting Mercury, Ketu, in her 11th house. This is where Saturn was by transit then. And then by 2016, by September 2016, she filed for a divorce and requested physical custody of their children. Again, all of this first, seventh, and second house stuff with Saturn transiting through that Bhavapada, first, second, and seventh house, requested custody of the children. Again, that's totally second house. Again, you have to understand, fifth house is what creates a child, but second house is our family. It's those things you have in your immediate environment, those things you surround yourself with, which includes your family, all of the people in your family. the family unit, right? The family unit that raised you, the family unit that you create. So second house shows all of those things, how you spend your money on the family, how the family is a measure of your wealth, blah, 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 all of that. So Saturn going over her first, seventh, and second house Bhava cusps showed first the attempt to make a commitment to it, and then the realization that it wasn't working, and then a rejection of that and of the partner, and a desire for physical custody of the kids because of the way Brad Pitt was acting. So again, when Saturn went over the 8th house Bhava cusp in her 4th, so again, you see it's the 4th from her ascendant, 1, 2, 3, 4 from her ascendant, was when Saturn went over the 8th house Bhava cusp. And then the 4th house, Saturn took away her breasts. And not just because it was going through the 4th house and aspecting her ascendant, but the 8th house Bhava cusp is there. Then Saturn went through her 5th house. You might say, well, why is it so much that just because she went into the Sun Dasha, why just going into the Sun Dasha does that end her relationship to Brad Pitt? It's not just the Sun Dasha. It's also Saturn transiting over the 1st and 7th and 2nd house Bhava cusps. Extremely important to understand. By aspect, Saturn was also aspecting the 3rd and 4th padas by aspect, and also the 7th house by transit. But it was most important in breaking up the marriage or bringing pressure to the marriage as going over the 1st and 7th Bhava cusps. It's also not just breaking up the marriage, but also getting married and making a commitment to the marriage. So this is how you can really see it. When Saturn was just about in the 5th house, or I'm sorry, it was just about to go over the Bhava padas, that's when she got married. And then once it went in a couple months later in November, she got married at the end of August. By November, it was going over the Bhava padas. By November of that year. Less than 2 years later, she ended it. So she made a commitment to it, and then for a couple years really tried to bring the family unit, her partner, and herself into that Saturn realm of, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm focused on, this is what I'm making a commitment to, but then she realized it's not going to work, and she ended it. Very important, and what changed in the midst of that is Venus is trying to make it work, and the Sun says, no, it's not working. That's what the Sun is. The Sun is where we realize that it's not working, and we break it up. That's what the Sun is. So I hope you liked this case study. I think it's a very good one that really shows not just Bhava padas in general, but the transit of planets to the Bhava padas. And I just looked at Saturn, but there were ways, like if you looked at, Jupiter and Mars, their transits also to the padas, there were some mutual aspects there as well. So anyway, it's very incisive to look at Rahu, Ketu, and Saturn as transiting Bhava padas to see what happens, and you can often see these kinds of things show up with a lot of force. And anytime you see Saturn or one of the nodes going over the Bhava padas, pay attention.